Welcome to the Film Riot Podcast. I'm Ryan Conley, and today on the show, we have something a little bit different. I did a Clubhouse with Scott Glassgold a little while ago, and we decided to record it just in case, and I'm glad I did because it was such a great conversation with so much amazing information from Scott, all about how to develop and sell feature films, really keeping an eye on the writer and director and how that pathway could work. Then at the end, we even had some people who were participating in the Clubhouse come in and ask some questions as well. Now, this was a Clubhouse, so the audio isn't the best, but the information was just too good to not put out. So just keep that in mind. The audio's not as good as it normally is, but if you know that ahead of time, it's fine. But before we do jump into that, I do want to thank our sponsor, and that sponsor is mixkit.co. This is a free resource that every editor and video creator should be using right now because Mixkit has free stock videos, music, sound effects, plus free video templates for Premiere Pro, After Effects, Final Cut Pro, and DaVinci Resolve. What's great about it is the assets on Mixkit are one, free, and two, they don't suck. They're high quality and have a great range for you to choose from. The video clips are great for your next project, whether it's just for B-roll or you want to just practice your editing skills. You can download as many videos as you need across their range that includes city videos, drone footage, nature clips, and a lot more. And for Adobe users, you're going to be able to get Premiere Pro and After Effects templates that are customizable Mogurt and project files, from transitions to title screens, lower thirds, and even YouTube overlays. These free templates are really great. They're solid stuff. And again, they're free. You don't even have to sign up. Just jump over to mixkit.co or go to filmriot.com/podcast, and you can find the links in the episode page for this episode. But now with all that out of the way, let's jump into it with Scott. So for everybody in the chat currently who might not know your work, could we start off just by you talking a little bit about yourself, your work, some of the stuff you're working on that you can talk about?
Sure. I am a manager producer, which means I wear two hats sometimes at the same time. My background is I actually started in the studio world. I worked at New Line for a long time and cut my teeth on development there, actually in New York City, when it was a unique time when there was a very active office there, which was a great moment. It's like sort of early aughts where films were being made out of that office. You still had sort of the exciting New York scene of theater and literary all sort of coming together and it sort of ebbs and flows in New York where it has inflection points and then sort of a new studio head will come in and cut back on the New York office. But I happened to be there at a time when a lot of movies were being made, and that I like to think of as my film school. And then I came out west with sort of an eye on producing films. And I was fortunate enough to find the rights to what became the movie known as Hurricane Season. It was a true story about a high school basketball team whose schools in New Orleans were decimated by the Hurricane Katrina, and they came together and won the state championships. And I managed to lock down those rights and put a movie together with Forrest Whitaker and Taraji Henson and Lil Wayne, and Tim Story directed, and that was my sort of jump headfirst into producing a film. Tell me, should I keep going? How much of the story should I need it, or am I rambling? This is my first Clubhouse. You tell me. I don't know.
No, that's great. I mean, you could talk a little bit about maybe some of the more recent things that you've done, pitched, sold, or because I know there's a few exciting ones. I'm pretty sure you could talk about all of the ones I know of.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to talk about everything that's announced. It's been a really interesting year with, let's call it the COVID year, March to March or what have you, where production for me anyway was really difficult. I operate in two spaces, traditional studio space and indie space. Studio space, you're still sort of always at the whims of the studio and what they're looking to make at that moment in time. Then on the indie space, and I should be clear, there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly with the theatrical outlets, in the sense of what, are theaters going to be open? What do theaters look like anyway? It's sort of the combination, the 1-2 punch of COVID and the existential crisis of theaters in general. So that, that's that side of it. And that's a little bit of, you're sort of handing your fate over to a studio. Whereas on the indie side, you certainly are in more control. It's just often way more of a dogfight. And to get an indie film made it's very much comes down to like the hundreds of thousands of dollars between getting a movie made or having enough money to make the movie. And with COVID, we just saw so many extra costs. I have a movie now that thankfully looks like it's going to be going. But even now, maybe shooting in July, we still have about $500,000 in COVID costs on a $7 million movie. So again, when you're dealing with a movie of that scale, that's a good chunk of the budget. So it was really tough in terms of getting things greenlit. Having said that, the marketplace for selling felt like it was really exciting and wide open. We sold a handful of films in the last year. Some of the more exciting ones were a project called My Wife and I Bought a Ranch, which we sold to Netflix, which was based on a Reddit short story in the no sleep section. And that just sort of overnight turned into just a monster bidding war. And Matt Query wrote a fantastic short story. And it just so happens that his brother, Harrison Query, is a amazing screenwriter who's fast on the rise. And that combination with the material at hand just sort of got everyone standing at attention. And we ended up selling that to Netflix in a very, very big way, and fortunate enough to have James Wan, Atomic Monster, come on, and Sean Levy's 21 Labs. So it really just sort of became a dream team of working on this project, and it's really special material. And it's still up on Reddit if anyone wants to read it. The cool thing is we sold it as a movie, but simultaneously we sold it as a book. So Grand Central Publishing would, let's see, I think it's, I paused because I didn't know if that was if I was letting out something confidential, but I think that's public. So that book is going to be coming out probably next year in like a really special big way. So in a perfect world, we have a book and a movie coming out at the same time. And so that's one. I mean, Harrison Query is a writer I work with regularly. We had a really fun sale back in January to my quasi home studio of Screen Gems. We sold them a script called Delilah, which is a really cool Gone Girl-esque thriller that Harrison wrote with Tommy Wallach, who's a fantastic writer all his own. And that one's fast tracked. And I think we're really close to putting a director on it and hopefully making it soon. So that was at least the tentpole highlights of this year, but a lot of fun stuff. Yeah, you tell me. I'm happy to keep rambling or asking more questions, whatever.
No, that's great. And we're definitely going to open it up to questions for everyone toward the end here, because I see some people have raised their hands. So we'll definitely get to questions, but I just want to chat about a few things first. And I think that's a really great kicking off point. I do want to talk a little bit more about maybe the process behind My Wife and I Bought a Ranch in a minute. But I guess for this whole thing, I guess I'm really interested in starting from the ground floor and working our way up, kind of keeping the writer, director, and the director all in mind, since each one's going to be a little bit different. The idea of talking about how the people listening to this could go about heading in that direction of developing and selling their first feature. And I guess, first of all, we could start with, do you need a manager or an agent to get the chance to pitch something to a production company or a studio?
Well, first you need a quality piece of material, and that all will emanate from you. And then I think it's about guile, right? It's about being really smart about how to get material in front of people. And there's all different kinds of gatekeepers, right? There are, for lack of a better word anyway. I mean, I think in 2021 we have the luxury of internet and being able to really contact whoever we want. We're not operating in this sort of really hard to reach place where, sure, you could reach out to anyone. They may or may not respond, but there's nobody you can't get to, or at least try to wave your arms and get their attention. So to me, the short answer is no, you don't necessarily need an agent. You don't necessarily need a manager. Having said that, if you have really great material and it gets into the right hands of the right rep, things can open up a lot quicker, right? And if the material is played in the right way. When I say play, I mean sort of like playing a great hand of cards that you might have, right? It's about recognizing the material, recognizing the best place for it. An agent or a manager, the right one, can really make all the difference. But at the same time, if you're clever enough or have that connection and get it to a producer or even straight to a buyer, which usually is a little bit more unlikely just because a studio or otherwise would be pretty guarded about getting unrepresented material that doesn't at least come from a producer. So I think along the way, it's very difficult to do it entirely on your own, but I think there's so many different configurations to get it done. That's for sure.
Yeah. So like phase one would be material. And if you're a writer that's writing, which I think is kind of an interesting place too. My wife and I bought a ranch is a really good for instance, because that idea of doing the short story on Reddit is pretty genius of getting material out there and getting it noticed. So would you say, let's thinking of the writer first, would you say for someone who is a writer who has this thing, maybe it's just a concept right now, maybe it's a spec script, what could they do with that to get started? Because it does very, I mean, and I know it felt very much like for me before I got my foot in is a who you know thing and you don't know anybody. So now what? For that person who doesn't know anybody and they're in that, so now what? And maybe they're just the writer. What would be that first approach? Maybe try to put short stories out there, or is there a way to send to reps? What would your advice be there?
Well, I think if you're a writer, I think it's writing to the medium that is your strength. In this instance, Matt Query had written some things just sort of on his own, but, his inclination was to write prose. And the piece is beautifully written. So for him, he just sort of did it on a lark. Like, I work with Harrison, I manage him, but Matt didn't write this story with like sort of a reverse engineering of let's turn this into a movie. He wrote this because it was sort of, like any writer who just sort of got to write a story. So for him, writing a screenplay would have been foreign. It was far more natural for him to write a short story, which he did. So that would be the same advice. I think wherever you feel like you can execute your concept the best, that's the space you should do it in. If it's in a screenplay form, great. If you feel like that can manifest in a short film, which is another space I spend a lot of time in, like, absolutely, right? Like something might only be realized if you can visually demonstrate how unique it is. And that's when I would say, well, then write a short, right? Like Matt happened to write a horror piece that is very conceptually delineated. For those of you who haven't read it, the really, really fast take or pitch on it is it's a couple moves to a ranch, only discovered that each season has a different haunting. So that's really conceptual, right? So like it's you can almost pitch it that quickly. Now, of course, the scares in there are really visceral and smart and unique. But I say that to say that's a version of a horror concept that lends itself to prose. Whereas if it's a little bit more of a creature orientation, then it might be like, well, maybe you should make the short film because that'll present differently. Like Matt's short story was fantastic. I don't really see it as a short film, right? You'd have to I take that back, but I mean to fully project 4 seasons anyway, that doesn't organically fit into a short film as much as it would a short story where you can cover a lot more ground is really what I mean to say. I mean, I suppose you could do a short film where you're just covering 1 season, but to truly generate the impact, the prose was probably the best form for it because it's limitless, right? Like you can go as big as you want when you're writing prose, whereas a short story, I should say a short film, you're obviously confined to your budget and your means that you have.
Yeah, for sure. And say you aren't somebody who writes prose in that way. Maybe you have a spec script. What would you suggest to do with that spec script? Go to, there are like festivals and stuff just for writing, or again, is there somewhere you could send it in for like, how do you get noticed off of a spec when you don't know anyone?
Look, I think now more than ever, it's easier to navigate that. And what I mean by that is there are super legit options like there's the Blacklist has the regular forum to submit scripts where you're not, again, it's more so about being cautious about electing to put your work into a bona fide service that isn't taking your rights, that isn't just a scam for money. So, you have the Nichols, you have the Blacklist. But then so that's sort of like a more like formal way to do it. The other way I would do, if you have a script that you think is fantastic and 3 friends have read it and told you it's fantastic too, I think there's always enough sort of word of mouth where you know someone who can get a read. And if the material is there, people will recognize it. So, it's very rare for a fantastic script to go unnoticed. I really believe that. So I think, again, it goes back to the point of guile, and I steal that. Joe Roth did like a interview in the LA Times like 15 years ago, and he was talking about the difference between being a studio head and a producer, and he used the word guile, and it sort of stuck with me. It's just, you've got to just be clever, but it's not just about being clever. It's about having the material, having the work too. But I do think if you've got a great script and it's in really good shape, and look, there's two versions of the script. There's a script that's going to go wild on the spec market. That's one thing. But then there's the other that doesn't have to go wild on the spec market, but really demonstrates your ability. And that will allow you to level up, whether that's getting you the right representation or getting, a producer to have an affinity for your work, and, they'll think of you for other projects or otherwise.
And what about the director? Would that just be short films, just getting a reel together to show for yourself? Like, what would you suggest there about, somebody who's never directed a film, doesn't know anybody, doesn't have a manager yet? Is that just manifesting work of your own to put out there to try to get noticed?
I think you have to. I think for a director, you have to be able to demonstrate your ability. And part of being a director is demonstrating that grit. And that grit is getting a short made. You're a general of your idea. And everyone who's on here who's made a short knows how hard it is just to make a short. It's really hard, and you're making it usually for a very limited budget, and you've got to pull favors. You've got to, have friends who are really talented help you out. And then even with all that, it's still really hard to make something good, right?
Yeah.
So with that being said, the proof is really in the work, particularly for a director, where it's like, I always, whenever I see a well-made short film, even if conceptually doesn't land with me, it tells me a lot about the character of that person. I mean, in a way, it comes down to the grit of that person. And for a director, particularly early on, but I would say even, later in their career, like sometimes that tenacity is the difference between someone who's really talented with no tenacity or pretty talented and really tenacious. Tenacity goes a long way with filmmaking. You know that, so it's like if you can put something together and do it smart and cheap and good, like people pay attention to that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that definitely kind of hits on a question that I have that is I asked a few filmmaker friends of mine to throw some questions at me that they would like me to ask. And, this is one of them. And it's kind of revolves around the whole same thing we're talking about here. It's, again, it was a much different world for me pre-managers and post-managers, getting indoors, getting generals and things like that started to happen on a normal basis. Whereas before it was never a thing unless, I put something new out and a few times it got noticed. But that was always producers. So the question from my friend is that he's always been told not to reach out to agents and managers, representation of any kind, that they'll reach out to you. So he was wondering about tips on getting either funding or just setting up generals with people that he should know outside of that idea of just making cool shit he's passionate about and crossing his fingers. But in my experience, that's really been all that I've ever known to do, is just make the next thing to hopefully that rings the bell loud enough. And that's what ultimately got my foot in the door, is just the right thing finally hit and rang the bell loud enough. And then, people did come to me. That was my experience, but I have a very limited experience. So I'm curious to hear your take on that.
Well, look, I think with the internet, playing field is just completely level. The onus is on the filmmaker to pull something together and go make something great. Like it's that simple. There's thousands upon thousands of people trying to break in as filmmakers. So if I'm an agent or a manager and someone is waving their arms to get my attention, like more likely than not, I'm probably a suspect of it. It's like, why doesn't this person already have representation? Because the inverse of that is, if they went and shot a fantastic short film and threw it up on YouTube or Vimeo, people will find it. People will go nuts for it. So at the end of the day, it's just about doing the work, And I do generally subscribe to the philosophy that you're speaking of, where it's like, look, there's nothing more powerful than the incoming call versus the outgoing call. And by you doing something great, putting it up online, and it brings in the incoming call, it's a night and day difference between, banging on someone's door to get their attention. Particularly now. I mean, look, that wasn't always the case, right? It's like, it's the Steven Spielberg comes out here with his canister of Amblin and hoping people will watch his film. Like, you really did have to bang on doors to show people your movie. Now you have your own platform where you can show it, send it around. And again, if it's good, people take notice. People out here are dying to find that next hot thing, right? Like that's all we hope for, is like, oh my God, this is the next breakthrough artist, or oh my God, this is the next big concept. Like day in and day out, that's what everyone's looking for. So again, if you create something that meets that demand, people will find it. There's no doubt about it. Nothing extraordinary goes unnoticed.
Yeah, that's been my experience so far. Is just the things that didn't get noticed. It was like, yeah, that's fair enough. But there's just been a few things that did get noticed and did get producers and production companies calling. And I've talked about it before. I have the benefit of Film Riot, and I've gotten some decent views on stuff that I put out. But each one of the things that got a decent amount of people contacting me from, I was getting contacted before the views ever, like Ballistic, I think is like 2 million views or something like that now. It was like 50,000 views, I think, when I was getting contacted the most. So it wasn't like that it was a million views and people were contacted because it was a viral thing.
Yep.
It was 2 years, 2 million after like, I think 3 years of being online, So something a friend told me forever ago, and it's proven itself to be true to me in my experience, at least, is that the cream rises to the top. And I've always felt like I put the thing out, the phone doesn't ring. Okay, I got to do the next one. And that's kind of been my approach and what has worked for me. So everything you said resonates with me for sure.
And the only thing I'll piggyback on that is it's even to this day, the things that sometimes I'm convinced will work. Like sometimes we create a viral piece to put out there. I'm like, oh, this is going to be gangbusters. And it's not necessarily. And then something that maybe I believe in it, but I'm hedging on whether it's going to click, just takes off like wildfire. So, it's the William Golden, no one knows anything, where it's like you do your best work and you put it out there, but there's just no set formula. That's the key to it. You can only game the system so much, right? Like you've really got to do the work. Hopefully it comes out the way you want and see what happens. If not, you just got to turn the page. I mean, I think that's a big mistake artists make as they're looking to break in. It's like, oh, I did a short 3 years ago and like still trying. Like if you did a short 3 years ago and haven't gotten your feature deal, like you got to go make another short. Like whatever it is, it's not turning the engine over and getting you that gig. It's like I see, people are far too generally, it's not always the case, but when I see that, I see someone who's really talented who came really close, but like your short isn't going to get any hotter 3 years from now. So if you weren't getting hired off that short, then like you just got to roll. It sucks, right? Sometimes it burns, but like you got to roll up the sleeves and do it again.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like I'm 18 years into it after film school, not even counting before. And that's been my experience too. Just keep going to the next thing. And I feel like there's an element of luck to it as well. And that's been inside and outside my foot in the door, even with Ballistic, like I was talking about with Ballistic and, the phone ringing on that one, but it largely was ringing because I, emailed out, I think like 50 different like blogs and whatnot for film, and one ended up posting it. And because of that one actually responding and posting it, that got, me some attention, and the ones before it really didn't get those. So it was the luck of, right place, right time. But I've kind of found that a little bit, even in the pitching landscape. We went out with something and it didn't really get picked up, but because of it, everybody wanted generals. And I just so happened to kind of see a glimmer of, oh, maybe this guy would be interested in this specific thing. And so I pulled my back pocket idea, and that turned into something that is actually, being developed now. So is that right time, right person, lucky sort of swing. So I feel like luck definitely has like a part to play in it, but as many times as you pull the slot machine, eventually,
I agree. And you bring something up that I think it's important to differentiate on is you hitting up 50 blogs and getting that one post. That is in relation to what I said earlier. That's very different than hitting up 50 agents, right? Like that's doing your job. When you create a short, you're the producer, and the second you're done as the producer, like you're PT Barnum. You've got to figure out how to sell the shit out of that short in the smartest possible way. And the smartest possible way isn't running it into an agency or a management company. It's putting it on a film site where hopefully it'll go viral. And by the way, like there are film executives who are scouring these sites looking for the next big thing. And there's that element of them wanting to discover it. It's like there's two versions of things that work. Either people discover it or it's the hottest thing on the planet. Those are sort of the two polemics. So like you either want to, like if I'm an executive, I either, I want to be first and find this thing before someone else does, or like it's this monster thing that's undeniable. And when it's the monster thing that's undeniable, I mean, that's the Fede Alvarez piece from years ago, or just, I had one or two that were just like, when we did True Skin, like that was just bonkers, right? Like, so you either want to be absolutely undeniable and then everyone's after you, or you want that passionate executive who sees it first and really feels like they're making a discovery. That goes a long way. But back to the point I was really trying to make is like, just throwing it up online is not enough. It's you've got to craft a strategy that makes it feel like people are discovering a diamond in the rough.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, something that I've been doing for a while is just I've talked about it all the time, but it's just something that I learned from my dad. You just, throw as much stuff as the wall as you possibly can. But comic books, podcasts, like there's so many ways to get different IP out there that then can be utilized, it seems like. So those are different avenues I'm approaching as well. Does that seem like something that adds value? If it makes sense, obviously, to the everything's got to be, authentic, but for the things like, if you say I have a spec script, a really good idea, but it's not getting traction, but it could be a great fictional podcast. Would that be a good route to then take that? And that's something that's doable to then put out there to maybe hopefully find an audience and use that to then transition maybe into a feature?
Look, I think I would say yes with an asterisk. Right. And what I mean by that is it's like there's no wrong way to do it. I think it's just about being really sure that you are conceptually strong, because you have to get clear on maybe why that concept isn't working in its first format. Right. And if it really is simply, it's not, it's not demonstrating the idea. It's not like, in other words, if your piece will really be serviced by a podcast, if by having actors speak the lines and you're sort of elevating it, great. Like, go do it. But it's got to play to that. Like, in other words, if it's an action movie, you're not going to turn it into a podcast because it won't register, So I think so yes to your answer, but you just have to be really, really calculated that you're not just making a left turn because you don't want to stay still. You just want to be really calculated about what you're doing, because all these things take a great deal of time, often money as well. So if it fits, then 100% yes. But, I'm of the belief that it's more about, from its first iteration, figuring out what the right format is for it. I mean, even go back to my wife and I bought a ranch, like we sold a Reddit story for over $1 million. Like that seems like a post on a public forum that doesn't necessarily seem like the right fit. But again, the structure of that site, that it's done in parts, and this was a story that was told in seasons. Like, I'm not going to sit here and be like, we sat down and made this a great game plan, because that wasn't the case. That was sort of luck. But again, it was the absolute right story for the right format, and it worked. So I think that's more important than anything. I think sometimes people have an idea, they have a script, it's like, oh, script doesn't sell, but if we do it a comic book, it'll sell. Maybe it will, but that's a lot of work. Everybody who's ever done a comic book knows that takes a really long time to do, and it's not cheap. So you just need to make sure you're really investing the time and money in the smartest way possible.
That's great. Yeah, totally agree. And let's assume that everyone listening is working toward their first feature. I think that's a good assumption to make. So I want to talk a little bit about choosing what projects to focus on, developing, attempting to take it out. Given again that we're talking about someone who is trying to get their first feature, be it a writer, director, or just a director, we'll focus on those right now. What sort of things do you think they should go for? Should you stay completely away from high budget stuff, for instance? Like, assuming that any of these things would be things that are in the wheelhouse of what they want to make and are passionate about.
So just so I can answer correctly, we're talking about a first-time filmmaker looking to make their first movie. What's the best design that they should come up with to get that done? Is that right?
Yeah, I suppose, like, because it's something I've heard a lot of, and it's been an issue with some of the stuff that, has even been pitched recently, as like, is there a budget level you want to stay away from? Is there a budget sweet spot for a first-time director? Are there some genres that are smarter to approach for your first than others that seem to work better for a first?
If I'm a first-time filmmaker and I need to get my movie made, I would make a movie. I would write a script that can be serviced for under $5 million. I would write it so that it can be independently financed. I would write it as contained as possible. I would design it with the expectation that I'm going to independently finance it, that I'm not going to set it up at a studio. These are all things that just time and time again, that's what gets it done. I made a movie called Prospect that was based on a short film. When the short film came out, we got a ton of offers to option that to studios. We said no. We said no because it was informed by the last 3 or 4 years where I think I sold 10, 12 shorts to studios and they all burnt out. They burnt out because executives, were fired. New executives came in and had no interest in it. They burnt out because, maybe that director wasn't quite ready for the studio system, to be honest. And even, equally as culpable, like maybe the idea wasn't entirely there because when you have a short film, it's the earliest, it's embryonic. Like you probably don't even have a script yet. So it's really early stage development. So the last place you want to be doing early stage development is at a studio because there's just so many chances for it to go wrong. So if I'm looking to make my first movie, whether it's based on a short or just the script that I write, I would try to hold on to it for as long as I can until the pieces come together. So Prospect was a movie that we had offers to do at a studio, at least develop at a studio, I should say. Held on to it. Zeke and Chris wrote the script. They wrote a fantastic script, but they also wrote a script that they believed they could execute on. Part of doing the short film was sort of testing some of those things, right? Like testing suits, testing special effects, testing the forest in which we ultimately shot it. The short film was shot in the whole rainforest. The feature film was shot in the whole rainforest. So what they did was they iterated and they figured out what they could and couldn't do. So by the time for us to then package a feature film, these guys were so convincing. They knew we had a budget. They had a lookbook that to this day, we hear compliments of like, that Prospect lookbook, the guys created a hardcover book with concept art, visuals, like graphic arts for what the food looked like, in the space pod. Like so specific that when they sat down with the financier, it was undeniable. You fully believed these guys had a handle on it. And that's how we got that movie made. And we had a production plan that was super unique in that it was long lead pre-production. We developed ships and otherwise for 6 months before we actually shot a single frame, and there was millions of dollars investments. And that was because it was so convincing. Aaron Gilbert at Braun saw the vision for the movie, believed in the guys, and it's super, super rare to get millions of dollars up front before you shoot a single frame, let alone before we cast Pedro Pascal. But that was because it was so convincing, the plan that they had, and the plan worked beautifully. The only flaw in their plan was we padded the schedule for rainy days because we were shooting in the rainforest. And it turns out it was too sunny in the rainforest. So we had to use our rainy days for Sundays. Other than that, their plan was flawless and they made a fantastic movie. And I have so many examples of that. Zach Lipovsky and Adam Stein, who I work with, had studio projects set up and, through the regular churn and development, they didn't come to life. Their movies, as talented as these guys are, and they had been Emmy nominated and really had traction. People believed in them, but they couldn't quite find their studio vehicle. And pent up with frustration, they went and made a movie called Freaks, which is just fantastic. They willed that movie together because they wrote a script for a budget of $1 million. I mean, they workshopped that script. Like we had roundtables of readings of those scripts endlessly in my office where people would just come in and read and read and read until that script was really as right and tight as it could be. They made that movie for $1 million using a ton of favors. Zach is really a prominent fixture in Vancouver. So they made sure they shot it there, called in every favor they could from, people working on the movie to the visual effects houses that helped bring it to life. And they made that movie for $1 million and sold it for 3+. And that was a movie that they entirely willed, but they willed it intelligently, right? Like they designed a movie that they knew they could pull off. And now these guys they're well on their way. I'm pausing only because they have 3 projects we haven't announced yet, but they're off of that movie. They've have just a robust opportunity, and it's all because they willed that first film together. Same thing with Angel Gomez. Well, we put a movie together called, in Spain, it's called Voices. Netflix renamed it it's called Don't Listen in America. I couldn't remember what it's called here, but so that was a movie that we developed. And, we took studio meetings on it. People were sort of interested. They're like, oh, that's kind of like White Noise, which was, a Michael Keaton movie from 100 years ago. And we're like, it's not, it's different. And, Angel's based in Spain. So we ended up getting Spanish financing for that, a combination of state money mixed with Netflix Spain. And he made that movie for $1 million in Spain, lost 3 days because of COVID. They had to wrap it short. but ended up getting a theatrical release in Spain. But the crazy thing is, Netflix dubbed that movie locally throughout the world, including the US. And that movie, dubbed in English, was in the top 10 in the US for over a month. And I could be wrong, but it was like roughly like in the top 10 in 100 countries around the world. And like, we literally, like, we just worked on that movie for, I mean, over a year just to get it right and tight to a place where it was something that could be done in a minimal amount of days. 98% of the movie takes place in a house. And it was all predicated on Angel's talent and his ability to create scares. And now, like, you know, he's on we put him on a Screen Gems movie. He's got 2 other movies that he's up for that, you know, are really big, prominent things. And that was the difference. Prior to that, and this is an important sort of bookend to his story because it's similar to all these other guys and gals, but it's similar in that, you know, Angel had sold a short film called Behind to Lionsgate with Sam Raimi. Sam was a tremendous booster for Angel. We went every studio in town. Sam literally put his arm around Angel and was like, this guy's the next Guillermo. He's amazing. Like, you couldn't have had better support. We sold it to Lionsgate. Zach Olkowitz, who's just a beast of a writer, was attached to write. And, you know, 18 months later, for a handful of reasons, that movie goes into turnaround. So here's a guy who's white hot, sold a short, looked like, you know, Sam behind him, biggest booster, you know, best horror mind in town. And the movie just devolves. But what gets made is the movie that he designed for $1 million. It's based on his story. And now it's, you know, it's opened up endless opportunities for him. I feel like I'm droning on, but like I can still point to like 3 or 4 other directors that I work with who did the exact same thing.
No, not droning on at all. That's all great. And for those who don't know, could you explain what turnaround is?
Sure. It's basically when a studio gives up on a movie and they're not going to spend any more money on it. Yeah. They wave the white flag. So, you know, look, there's a few different ways to look at that. So and I say that particularly in relation to a short film, because a short film, so the short film is under option just the same way a book would be under option. So when something goes into turnaround, that's the whole package. That's script and short together. Whereas you have a ticking clock, sometimes it's 12 months, sometimes it's 18 months to find another home for it. And let's say Lionsgate doesn't want it, but Paramount does. Paramount's got to pay for all the money that's against the movie, meaning everything that's paid for the script, paid for the short, producer development fees. And, you know, it's always like these bogus line items of lawyer fees. Or we had one from a studio that I won't name where they sent us all the turnaround costs. And this was like within the last like 6 months, and they had like messenger fees. And I was like, messenger? Like, who uses a messenger anymore? Like, you guys, like this is like an old, you know, billing system that you're still billing for messengers. That was pretty ridiculous.
You got to pay for the pigeons, man.
I mean, come on. But who's using, like, just send an email. I don't think anyone's using messengers anymore. But anyway, so my greater point is that, but the thing to keep in mind for filmmakers who are making short films is the short film, once the option expired on that film or any film in general, that comes back to the filmmaker free and clear. Now, you cannot use any elements of the screenplay that was developed for that short unless you pay the turnaround fees. But you do get your short back free and clear, and you're allowed to iterate with that. We did that on, you know, a few projects where we were, True Skin was a project that we had at Warner Brothers as a big old feature film, didn't pan out. We got that short back and then sold it to Amazon as a TV show. So it was entirely different conceptually that Nicole Perlman was writing. And that was free and clear because we were just using the underlying piece as IP, but we weren't using any of the existing script. So, you know, maybe that's a little in the weeds, but it's something to know that you're not totally stuck with those turnaround costs necessarily.
Yeah. Well, let's move into actual pitching. And for me, there were like 2 levels of this. So starting at the first, you know, like I said, put the short out, and then production companies, producers wanted to jump on the phone and hear about the feature vision. I'm pretty sure you've been a person on the other side of that call wanting to hear about the feature vision. So with a call like that, you know, you saw this short, you love it. Is there a feature version of this? You want to get on the phone with the filmmaker. What do you expect to hear from that filmmaker? What should they have prepared?
It's a good question. I mean, it really depends on the filmmaker's goal. It's sort of a 2-parter. One is, primarily, does the filmmaker want to write the piece? Because if I've seen a short film and I'm super excited about it, let's say I'm blown away by it, right? That director in many ways has already passed a test for me. I've seen his work, and clearly if I'm on the phone jumping up and down about it, like, it's really good. She has done a fantastic job, right? Now, alternatively, if that director is like, I made this short and I also want to write it, that's a whole other conversation because I don't know how you write. I know I know you can either do scares or if it's sci-fi, I know you can do visuals, whatever it is, but writing a screenplay is a different muscle. So that immediately factors into it. So what I would recommend to somebody who wants to, if you're a first timer that wants to write and direct, I really do think for the most part, I would rewind and go back to my previous suggestion of writing it yourself because it's going to be a big leap for someone. If you're an untested writer to get a deal to write it, it just is few and far between. And by the way, I don't necessarily recommend it. I think you're probably, again, this is if you want to go into the studio system. If you want to go into the studio system, I would partner with a screenwriter who has been there before, who sort of knows the expectation and can help you navigate what can be a pretty choppy waters, right? But I want to make sure I'm at least offering a little bit of an answer to your question because I think this still happens, whether or not you're talking about actually pitching it or just connecting to a producer or otherwise. I think it's that initial call when they're talking to the filmmaker, regardless of what a feature pitch would be, right? Because I think this happens even more so. It's like just want to get a sense of this director. I don't think it's necessarily anything that the caller is conscious about, but it's sort of like the spectrum of anything. I would consider it like a first date, right? Like it's even as simple as like connecting with them, getting along with them, like for lack of a better, like, is this person a lunatic? Like, do I want to then go turn around, go to my home studio and say, I know this person's unproven, but you've got to take a bet on them because then it's their credibility too. So it's temperament as much as it is talent. Because remember, if you did a great short and they love it, they already know you're pretty talented. But it's like, can I work with this person? And that's not to say you have to be in a way that you're just sort of like kowtowing to an executive. That's not the point because they want you to have a very clear vision and be assertive. But I think it's about finding that rapport. But at the end of the day, it's like, does this person have a clear vision for the material? Do they know where they want to take it? And even if they don't want to write it, they would have a sense of what the piece will feel like, what it'll look like, tonally, thematically. Like all these things are so important. Even allegorically, what you're trying to say, you just want, particularly in a short where sometimes it can be a little bit of vaporware. You want to be certain that there's just a depth to this person's point of view.
Let's move on to full blown pitches.
Sure.
Because then there's that next level of you're now taking it to either, your managers have set it up. You've got the request for a full pitch, formal pitch to a production company, or you're with the production company developing and taking to the studio. What does that larger pitch look like? My wife and I bought a ranch, for instance. You sold to Netflix, right?
We did. That's not a good example because that one's bananas. that one, I mean, we started showing that on a Wednesday and by Friday morning we had a closed deal.
Oh.
So there was no pitch for that. There was,
you bastard.
100%. Like, look, it's a combination of things, right? It was super fortuitous that Harrison Query was the brother of the writer. Harrison was a known entity. He had already sold pitches to half this town already. People were familiar with their writing. So if I read this short story and see how strong it is, and I know that there's a really smart writer attached to it, a smart writer is attached to it who, his brother wrote it. So there's just going to be such a shared sensibility that's a pretty good bet. That's rare and it doesn't happen too often. That's happened with short films as well too. Although again, that does not really happen with short films anymore. But there was a time when we were just sort of, selling shorts off of the heat of that week's views. Having said that, to a more, traditional example, let's see. We sold a short last year called The Follower to Paramount that Jonathan Breyer made this short. He's a fantastic German filmmaker. And it was all sort of done, in that like unfriended kind of way where it was all in device. And it was a babysitter who was getting stalked, which sounds like a, really sort of broad idea. But the execution was so good that it really demonstrated both concept and ability as a filmmaker. But while it demonstrated concept, it wasn't obvious that it was a feature film. So for that process, we went and met with, we set the short around. I mean, I'll really get, this is a good example because this was like from, it was well received, but it wasn't so viral that people were just taking off the table. And that's what you do, by the way. It's like you kind of hope for the viral and like, oh, do I not have to do any work and just, sell this thing? And you'll know very fast if that's the case, or any further work, I should say, right? In terms of fleshing out a pitch. Having said that, this is one where people are like, this is fantastic. What's the take? And once you start hearing that, everywhere, you're like, oh shit, we better really work on a take. So we interviewed a handful of writers. And Aaron Saleh is a super talented writer who, I guess he had been up for another project that we were looking for a writer for. It didn't quite work out, but like his ability was undeniable. And he sparked this material. And I mean, it's really just about grinding. I think a pitch has to be really, really refined. Like it's really hard, in my opinion, to get a pitch in really strong shape. Like it takes a minute. And what I mean by that is like you really have to workshop. You have to go and take your meetings, beyond just going to reps. You're going to want to pitch friends. You're going to want to even, I was attached as a producer to this, but we would take a producer partner, which we ultimately did on this one. But even I say that to say, like, you take producer meetings to see who your partner is and you pitch it 10 times. And as you're pitching it 10 times, you're workshopping it. It's only getting stronger and stronger. But I think, you really want to make sure you're in a place where it's an airtight 15 minutes. And I think once you're pitching, as much as I'm saying, like, there's a version of it where you can rush material if it can stand on its own. With a pitch, my advice always is to get it right and tight. I mean, there's nothing, the executives value their time so much, right? And by the way, like if you're a rep, you're vouching for it. And like, you don't want to vouch for something that's not all there. Like, because the next time you call an executive to hear it and it's not there that first go around, like maybe it is there the second time, but that guy just got burned. He's like, you wasted an hour on like a pitch that was really had tons of holes and then a waste of time. So like really for everyone's sake. And by the way, like that's very often if you're a young filmmaker and this is your first time in the room, you're making a first impression. So that even if these people don't buy it, which by the way, they're most likely not going to buy it, this is your audience. This is your chance to perform for them and make an impression where if you're in the room, they've probably seen your short film. So like, oh, this person's talented. And then you're in the room and you give just a great pitch in coordination with your writer or if you're just the writer. So even if, sorry, we've got something just like it, or it's not theatrical or whatever of the, 100 excuses you can hear, there's still a win in there, even if it's a no, if you got your shit together. But you gotta be right and you gotta be tight because you're representing yourself, you're representing the producers in the room, you're representing your reps. And it just goes a long way because, that person didn't hire you for that, but you made a great impression. And then they have an open director assignment for something else. And then maybe you go in for that. And there's already a level of comfort with you because they saw, the way you present, the way you carried yourself, how smart you were in the room, how prepared you were with, as much as the pitch is important, the Q&A is important afterwards. It was like, wow, they had all the answers. And again, you hope they buy it and you're at least off to the races in this race anyway. But it's still all sort of tying back to what we're talking about like getting in rooms is great. But once you're in the room, what are you doing? And hopefully you're getting into the finish line and selling it. But there are other wins to be had in the meantime.
And what about format? Is there any specific sort of format you like to take in the room every time, or is it different every time? Like, do you like to have the visuals with the text? Is there ever a time where it's just straight story pitch? Do you like the filmmaker to have it written out and really rehearse, or do you like them to go off memory if they can? Are there any specifics that you find work better than others, or does it just depend?
It's funny. I think the best thing to happen to a pitch, and the reason why we sold so much this year was Zoom. And that probably sounds counterintuitive, but
I couldn't agree more with that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. 100%.
It's the combination of the visual component mixed with the picture, whatever, with the writer, director, whatever it is, having their notes in front of them on Google Slides, let's say, so nobody can see the notes. You look like you're looking dead in the camera. And obviously you're familiar with them, but it allows you to sort of be somewhere between reading and improvising or just going off of memorization with a very succinct slideshow with it. It goes a very, very long way versus a bunch of people in uncomfortable seats staring at each other. I mean, look, there's always a double-edged sword. The double-edged sword is that person's getting their emails and their texts at the same time, and hopefully you have their attention. But just from a specific presentation perspective, it's so smooth. Because even like, a year ago when we were going to offices and you did have a visual presentation, it's like so stressful. Like you got to get there 10 minutes early and IT is coming. You're sweating your HDMI cord and you're like, oh shit, I hope this works. Where, you're in a way, you're sort of playing on your home field by having it through, your Google Slides. It's your theater. And I think that goes a long way. I mean, I think, well, whatever. But we've sold a bunch of pitches this year, and I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, just having that home field advantage has been huge. And that's very much how I've done it too, is like I put sort of my bullet point script right below the webcam. So it's, I'm looking in that direction. And then I have my iPad synced into Zoom. So that's playing all the slides, and it's just worked so well. It's been so easy to do it that way. So I've really loved that.
I'm curious to see what happens next. As we go into offices, I wonder if the prelim pitch will be Zoom. And then it's like, oh, we really liked it. Why don't you just come in and well, again, it's to maybe get that personal feel or otherwise. But I don't know what stays and what goes. But I could see look, a year ago, like if you wanted to pitch 10 places, logistically setting meetings, getting times, driving all around town. I mean, it was exhausting. It was a nightmare. And it was just super hard to plan out. Whereas if you have something and you want to tee it up, you can set your, 6 primary buyers in a day and bang it out. And by the way, like that's also ideal for leveraging the market, right? Where like you would let them know very clearly, everyone's hearing this today. What are you going to do? Versus, you pitch Universal on Monday, but you can't get into Paramount till Thursday. Like that's a long time. And this is a small town. And if word gets out that you pitch Paramount on Monday and they didn't make an offer, like all of a sudden your balloon is losing a little air and you better hurry up. So the fact that you can, really sort of bake these on one day or two, or even prize it where it's like, oh, you're hearing this on Friday, everybody else is hearing it on Monday. There's a lot of ways to design it that presenting digitally offers.
Yeah. And one other question I have as far as format goes are pitch videos. So I've tried to get people to agree to going with a pitch video, but it's been denied over and over again. And the reasons I've been given here and there have all made sense, but I'm curious of what you think about a pitch video. Because to me, it just makes so much sense. It's going to be the perfect form of the pitch. You can add extra things to convey tone. Obviously, if you can execute on a well done pitch video. But I even saw one. I mean, it had known actors in the pitch video, so that definitely helped its appeal. But I saw one and it worked wonderfully to me. So I'm kind of curious what you think about pitch videos and why you think there's such a pushback on them.
Let's see. I've yet to see them really work in a meaningful way when there wasn't a star in it. Every time something comes up, I shouldn't say every time, but when I have something that has a star component, that's the first thing we consider if they're not available. But the thing is, if you can get that star in a Zoom, and we've done that a few times this year, I saw the pitch called Heads of State to Amazon with John Cena and Idris Elba. And those guys were really supportive of the project and they were on the Zoom. And if I'm the head of a studio and these major stars are on the Zoom, like you've got to pay attention in a way that like, you're not going to skip out on that meeting, even just for relationships, right? You're not going to blow off some of the biggest movie stars in town. Whereas, by the way, like, I don't want to use those guys as an example, just celebrity A and celebrity B put themselves on video. It's so much easier to pass on a video that went around where it's like, oh yeah, like you don't even know that you get the views, right? You don't know that the right person watches it. Something about it feels sterile. Now, don't get me wrong, like that is not the hard rule because there were few high profile pieces that sold through video. I'm guessing that was a part of logistics, like the Jake Gyllenhaal piece that sold. Like, if he's shooting and you want to make sure you have his presence at every piece, yeah, put on the recording. But I also like the pieces that sold were really high profile, and I think that helps too. If you're a younger filmmaker and you're looking to get in there, I think you want to be there even digitally, but you want to be there live. Anytime like it's a young filmmaker, like an executive or a buyer, if they're truly interested, like they're going to throw you a fastball and you need to hit it out of the park, right? Whether it's a question, whether they interrupt you halfway just to knock you off your game, to sort of test you. Like these things are real. And if it's a video, it's just such a vacuum. Again, always an exception to the rule. You do an extraordinarily clever piece and you surprise or you reinvent the medium, Godspeed. Like, do it. It'll catch wildfire, but it's the exception in my opinion. And again, there's 10 examples of how I am wrong, but just my gut and what I've experienced is the latter.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I have one more question, which is another one from a filmmaker friend, and then I'm gonna open up for some questions for people who are listening. And it's about how to decide what project to take on any given moment for you and for a filmmaker. Just from, I guess, talking from your standpoint to start with, how do you pick the next project to sort of dig into when I'm sure there's a ton that you have waiting to go forward? I mean, I'm sure you're always doing a multitude of things at once, but how do you choose what you're focusing on?
It's a good question. I mean, and by the way, I think those are two different questions. I'm gonna parse them. What I'm focusing on and what I'm taking on, I think, are two different things. What I'm focusing on more often than not is less dictated by my schedule and the schedule of that particular project. What I mean by that is, project A, the writer is off writing. He's been given notes. We went over a beat sheet. He could be gone for 4 months. That could be my absolute priority, that project, right? Like, it's my favorite project. I'd make a ton of money if it gets made, like, whatever it is. But if the writer's writing for 4 months, that's not my focus. There's nothing for me to do. Now, I'm obviously monitoring it, but it all of a sudden goes away, right? So, but at any given time, there are things that need focus, whether it's closing a rights deal on an IP or reading a pitch to take out, whatever it is, like, that will present itself. And I think then in that regard, you've sort of have to prioritize within there of, like, there's all different reasons for things to be prioritized, but I mean, there's only so much time in the day, right? So, but the focus generally is dictated by the schedule that the project is on. And as we're ramping up to go make a movie, hopefully this summer, what you find is more and more oxygen is used on that thing that is, nearly in pre-production. And it was a good reminder for me, even over the past few weeks, where it's like, oh, I'm, talking to department heads and things that just, again, ultimately producing a film becomes a full-time job. And these other things, more often than not, need to take a back burner. That's when I'll make a conscious decision of, like, oh, now is not a good time to take on other things, whether it's new clients or new projects. So then it was things to focus on. And then the other part of your question, which is a fantastic question, is choosing what to pursue. And, I would then even divide that into two things of clients to pursue and projects. And projects, to me, it's sort of like, it's a little bit of like, it when you see it. It's that Venn diagram of, like, wow, that's a really fantastic writer, director, or things that I'm drawn to just as much is, a fantastic true story, or a fantastic short, or something that, that has manifested. But equally, like, it's, I'll go back to the writer director version of it, exclusive even of representation. It's, wow, that person's super talented. What do they want to do next? Like, that's the most exciting conversation to have. Like, there's nothing better than that, because if you saw something that they've done and it's really good and they're emerging, chances are they've got some really fun things up their sleeve. And to develop that out is, like, that's as exciting as it gets. So that's a part of it. But I think, in terms of what I take on equally, I think you have to be, but that's an investment in talent too, right? Whereas when just sort of looking at it on, like, a project basis, you have to be pragmatic. Like, if something just feels like there's just no version of you finding a home for it, that doesn't mean you stop tracking it or otherwise. But I think you have to be cognizant of where the market is. You only have so much time in the day. So I think there's some pragmatism that has to be applied. And then guess what? Sometimes, like, you have to even defy that. You're like, this makes no sense. It's stupid. It's antithetical to everything that's selling. But, like, I can't stop thinking about it. It's fantastic. I'm going to prove everyone wrong. And, like, by the way, sometimes that's just as fun too. But I think you have to at least listen to that voice and, sort of be practical about it. So if you know what you're doing is possibly the impossible and you still do it, that's fine. but you just have to be honest with yourself, right? And then I think that has to be your priority in terms of like even how much time you're willing to put into it.
What about like going back to like, that first time filmmaker who's either, outside or has a foot in the door and is trying to get something made? Because it often can feel like a waste of time, even when things are requested. How often anything actually goes in any kind of way is, next to zero.
Mm-hmm.
So how, do you figure out what to focus on? That because in my experience so far, it does seem like, at least to me, that there are seasons in Hollywood. I had one project go dead silent on me, and then all of a sudden it just seemed like the town was primed for that sort of material. My managers even mentioned it, and all of a sudden the interest went through the roof, and we got a ton of meetings off of it when year prior we couldn't. So is that something that you see that exists? Is it something that a writer director should be keeping their eye on? If so, how? Or not at all? And there's another thing that you would advise a client as far as how to really dig into whatever that next thing is.
Well, I mean, I think the thing to be careful of, and it's funny, Zach Lipovsky, who's a client I work with, posted a graph on his Facebook of like all the ODAs, open director assignments that those guys went up for. And I think it was like 50. And like, I don't think they got one. But having said that, then also on that chart was self-generated projects. They sold 4 out of 5 things that came from me or from friends. And it was like sold 3 out of 4. I say that only in the sense of this may be a little too specific, right? But as you start making some headway, maybe you have representation and you're being sent scripts, they ultimately saying yes to every project that you're reading on and, building out a pitch and a presentation can become a tremendous time suck. So I think if I'm a director, if I'm a filmmaker, I think you need to figure out what that ratio is that feels right to you. And I think my advice is for that ratio always to be leaning towards self-generating, writing for yourself, creating for yourself, however you're generating, whether it's a short film, short story, or a script, you got to tip the scales for yourself. And then an ODA comes in and you're like, I fucking love this. I know how I would do this as a movie. Or like, they're remaking some childhood cartoon that inside and out. I can get in the room and I can speak to it till I'm blue in the face. Go after that. Because like there's true passion there. And look, I think by the way, like even just to distill that even further, I think it just does come down to passion. And if like what you're creating, you're more passionate about, don't necessarily look to sort of play the game of going out there or say, all right, I'll take this ODA, not necessarily because I love this property and I even think I'm going to get it, but I don't know that producer and I'd love to develop a relationship with them. I'd love for them to see how talented I am, how smart I am. So I'll pitch, but like, you don't half-ass it again, because this is your audience, right? Like this is your first time in a room with them. You want to impress them because you have an ulterior motive of not just to get this gig, which would certainly be great, right? But it's like, I'm going to just impress these guys so much that they'll think of me for something else. So again, I think it's just being really calculated where you're spending your time.
Gotcha. And ODA, for anybody who doesn't know, is just open director's assignment, right?
Open director assignment. A studio will have a script that they love, but they want to send it out and get a director on it.
Great. So now, I think it'd be great to open up to any questions anybody listening might have. So I'm gonna grab the first one, and the way that I'm gonna handle questions on this is usually in Clubhouse everybody just stays up here, but I want to keep it organized. So I'll bring you up for a question, and after we're done, I'll send you down and bring up the next one, just so we stay as organized as possible with it. So I'll bring up the first one here. Olaf, how's it going, man?
Ryan, great, man. First off, that sounds like a great idea. Thank you for having an organized clubhouse. They're usually such a disaster of people everywhere trying to yell over each other.
Right. It usually gets to a point and you don't know what anybody's talking about anymore.
Yeah, and you're trying to find the little bubble of who's speaking. Scott, thank you so much for all your insight already, and props for Prospect, man. I've been a fan of that since the short and was stoked when I saw it as a feature. So
thank you so much. Appreciate it.
My question, to cut right to it, is I'm stuck in the middle of butt-fuck nowhere, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And when you're starting from quite literally zero, you have zero connections, zero places in LA or any of that kind of thing. What is the best way to start the conversation? Because I've got a mountain of rejection letters that I'm saving, but for basically saying, hey, we can't even look at this. And it's friends of friends you need or a recommendation. But what's your best recommendation when you've got a pitch, a script, an idea, everything ready to rock, but you just need to get in front and have those conversations?
Just to be clear, so this is from a writer's perspective, yes?
From a writer-director's perspective. So just a bit of background. I'm a director, filmmaker, work specifically in visual effects a lot. So it's kind of my bread and butter. But I've had a short film that I've turned into a feature idea, and the short film doesn't even hold a candle to what it would be anymore, or where it would be as far as an achievement technologically, visual effects, cinematography. It doesn't compare to what it is now. So I wouldn't even use it as a place to start or point someone to other than the name. But the script is written, the pitch is ready to go, the team is ready to go. We haven't got casting, but our main cast is a visual effects robot. So that's the short of it.
I mean, look, bearing in mind what you said, I wouldn't mention the short at all, right? Because to me, what comes to mind is like, oh, I want to see that short, but you're telling me, it's not necessarily applicable anymore. So you should just separate the two, because I don't think it doesn't seem to do you any value, right? But here's the paradox, that if you want to write and direct it, you need to put forward something that demonstrates your ability, right? So maybe it's about iterating on something entirely new, but super contained, but is technologically speaks to, where you are right now. And I'm not saying it has to be long, right? I subscribe to shorts being as short as possible to demonstrate, like, you get in, demonstrate your ability, demonstrate concept, and get out. So even if you do the 3-minute version of that, and again, it doesn't have to be VFX heavy. You could shoot it entirely in a room and have one VFX at the end. And that can go a long way to getting you some attention, to having the most up-to-date piece on your reel. But if it just sounds like there's a little bit of a disconnect between the short and the script.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And that's kind of the path we're going on right now. I guess my main problem is once that's done, like Ryan's having conversations, Booth is in here too. He's having conversations. I just don't even know what the best way to start those conversations without starting or sounding like someone who's just randomly knocking on a door. When you feel like you actually have something to offer, it's just kind of the paradox I'm in, specifically where I am as far as my location.
Sure. But let's say hypothetically you went and you took 4 months and put together a really great short. And then, going back to Ryan's model of, you've got a really kick-ass, undeniable short, even if it doesn't speak specifically to the concept of your script, and you blow it out, send it to 50 blogs, hit it to, Jason Sondage short of the week. Like, you get it out there, and all of a sudden people are like, that's the coolest thing I've seen all year. What is this person up to next? And you're like, hey, I've got this amazing script. They're like, well, this is a really great short. So clearly you're capable. And oh wow, like, that's a VFX short, and your first script has a robot throughout. I entrust that you can pull this off. And then all of a sudden it's you're using your skills and your talent to sort of draw people in versus again, the inverse of that is like, hey, read this script. I want to write and direct it. But it's it sounds like if there's a robot in it throughout the whole piece, it's not a VFX robot. It's not going to be dirt cheap. So it sounds like there's going to be some cost there. And if there's cost, like, I need to know that you can pull it off. So I'm going to need a directing sample. So my gut is you need to go do a new piece.
Yeah, I think that's what my gut was saying too. And you've just underlined it. So thank you.
Cool, man. Send it to me after you shoot it. I'd love to check it out.
Absolutely. Love to. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks, Olaf. Olaf is actually a friend and an unbelievable artist. He's not going to say it about himself, so I'll say it. His work is some of the best I've seen online, so I have no doubt that, when you make that short, Olaf, it's going to make some major waves. So I'm stoked.
Well, let me double down and say definitely
dude,
send me that short.
Believe me, you're going to want that short. I'll send you some of his work afterwards.
Send it. Do unreal. It. But I mean, that's awesome. And that's the point. It's like, what we were going back to before. It's like, all right, maybe, the previous short has grown dated. It's not even a reflection of ability, or maybe it is. Maybe your skills have, gotten even more advanced, or there's software that wasn't necessarily available to an amateur before, or professional, whatever level. But now the cost of software has gone down, or whatever it is. It's like, you've got to stay one step ahead of it. So, the model for a short film is very similar to an indie film of like, write something that you can pull off. And a short film, particularly if you're able to do your own VFX, if you design something in a really smart way, it ought not cost you that much money. Like, you just have one effect at the end, but if it's smart and it's good, I mean, David Sandberg's Lights Out, is just a woman in an apartment until the very last shot, where they, that a shot that doesn't really hold up that much anymore, but it demonstrates that whole movie demonstrates ability. So just, I would say, craft something that really plays to your strengths. Do it as short as possible, because that's often a mistake. And I know, Ryan, I think last time we did a podcast, we talked about it too, where, the 10-minute short. And it's like, to me, the short should be as short as possible, because what you're there to do is demonstrate your craft, demonstrate concept, and anything longer than that, you're taking your resources of production, of post-production, and you're putting it into a short that doesn't need to be that long. Whereas you can compress all those resources into 3 minutes versus spreading it out over 10. And it's way better to have a fantastic 3 minutes than a pretty good 10.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great answer, man. I'm going to bring up another. This is William. Should be coming up. No, maybe he's gone. All right, let's try somebody else. Am I doing this wrong? Okay, here we go. Tyler. Oh, we got Tyler and William. Okay, so let's start. Tyler, let's go ahead and start with you with your question. Then I'll just leave you up here, William, and then I'll jump to you.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. Scott, Ryan, thanks for doing this. This is always so helpful. So I've got basically 2 invitations to a room to pitch some stuff. And I've got like the one kind of main project that I've been developing for a while. It's the passion project. It's the one that means the most to me. However, I've heard of this happening several times, that, you get through a pitch, and whether they like it or not, they kind of want to hear like, well, what else do you have? They may not want the high concept sci-fi that I've got, but they may be interested in a horror film for, whatever that might be. So do you guys recommend putting extra time into kind of these like secondary, tertiary ideas that you may have that you could also pitch, and kind of be ready to like roll out like, oh, you don't like this? Well, or maybe you don't, maybe they like that idea, but they want to hear some more. And so you've got these like other pitches kind of like in your back pocket. Or is it best to just say, well, I've got some other things I'm working on, and I can get back to you?
Well, my answer to that is yes, you want to have multiple ideas, but you also want to be really savvy about how you're presenting those multiple ideas. Right. What you don't want to look is thirsty. You don't want to be like, you don't like that one? What about this? Like all of a sudden, like, and no reflection of you. It's just like, I've seen it happen where it's like, the person who's desperate to pitch you that next idea just looks so thirsty that you're just like, oof, like, like it makes me wonder, like, wait, why is this person so desperate to pitch me these ideas? So I think it's really about being smart and prizing them in a way that feels a little bit more, for example, it's like, hey, like you pitch them like, no, not this one. And say, well, I've got something that that it looks like I've got a deal that's coming on. I'd rather not pitch it. And they're going to be like, no, please let me hear that thing that you're about to sell to someone else. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to pitch it, but I'm not sure it's even available. They're like, no, please. And then all of a sudden you're shifting the dynamic. And to me, that's just as important as it is what you're pitching. It's how they're receiving it. So you just want to be very, very smart about that. Otherwise, the second you always want them chasing you, and the second it's the other way around, like just doesn't end well. And by end well, it's thanks for coming in, so you just want to be really protective of yourself and never like, you need to go in there with the attitude of like, if this doesn't work, there's going to be 10 other places to pitch it to. And, it's just it's the cliche, but it's true of like, just never let them see you sweat. It's like, great. If you guys like this, cool. If not, I'm going to go down the road and sell it. So I don't care. Like you, even if it's not true, you have to feel that way. And I don't even mean feign it, although you certainly can feign it, but like you have to believe it, because if you're operating from any other approach, it reads and it just, no matter what you're saying, it just, people can tell.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Sure.
Excellent. Thanks, man. William, how about you, man?
Sure. Hi. First off, this has been great. I've enjoyed listening to all you guys' insights in the conversation. Ryan, at the beginning of the conversation, you had mentioned about Ballistic, that you had submitted the film to 50 blogs. And I was just curious to know, and Scott, as you've been talking to, like what are those blogs? When you say blogs, what were those blogs that you submitted to? And who was the audience on those?
I just went online, and I mean, obviously there was an easy 2025 off the top of my head, you know, the Indie Wires, the Hollywood Reporter, Deadline, Slash Film. First Showing is the one that actually ended up pushing it down, one short of the week, you know, anything like that was an honest reach out, you know, wasn't just literally anyone. It was places that I knew of that I do, you know, frequent their publication or have. And it, you know, it seemed like what I was doing made sense for them. I just wasn't blanking it out to literally anyone. It's like, you know, I'm not sending it to like makeup blogs or anything like that, you know. So it was pretty much that. I just built out a list of those people, and then I hunted down. It took it was weeks and weeks of work of finding out who to send it to, and then crafting each individual email as not this copy paste email, but you know, a personal email to them to, you know, this is why I'm sending it to you, you know. So it was all very honest and authentic to each individual place I was sending it to. And I don't think, probably more than not, like 80% of them didn't even open the email. But like I said, it ended up just having that one. But it was just a matter of finding the things that made sense to send it to. I think, yeah, that one and the one before I also sent to places like Sci-Fi Wire, because it was sci-fi and it made sense. And I think Sentinel got picked up by Sci-Fi Wire. So stuff like that. Anything that felt like it made sense for the project.
The only thing I'll add to that is, you know, it definitely a different time. Like there were a few years back where you would hit up a blog with a hot short, and I mean, you kind of would just sort of sit back and like, all right, if you knew you had the goods, like you put something up in the morning, and like by the afternoon, you knew you'd have incoming calls. It's a little different now. Like the nature of the short film going viral isn't quite there the way it used to be, but there are still real proponents of it. Alex Billington at First Showing is like one of the, first of all, he's a great guy, but he's also a huge booster for short films. So that should always be a first stop. Jason, who I mentioned earlier at Short of the Week, those guys curate in a way that's meaningful. Again, it doesn't have the same impact. It used to be like you got a Vimeo staff pick or otherwise. Like it really was a jolt of lightning. Not quite, you know, it speaks more to like the internet in general just being so cluttered these days, whereas a few years ago there was a little bit more of a runway. But having said that, it's still the same approach because you've got a YouTube link. Anybody can make a YouTube link. But if you can go from a YouTube link to a First Showing link, all of a sudden you're legitimized ever so slightly more. So even if First Showing is fantastic, by the way, but I'm just saying, even if you don't get the eyeballs you want there or otherwise, but then you want to turn around and send it to a producer or send it to a manager, or, hey, a friend of a friend, can you get it to them? You're not just sending them a YouTube link, which has no validation to it because, you know, anybody can create a YouTube link. But to get past a gatekeeper of a bona fide blog and your short lives there, the next person level up, if you will just take it that much more serious in the sense of like, hey, you know, my friend just did this really great short. Can you check it out? It's blowing up on First Showing. Like that's going to elicit a click a lot faster than, hey, my friend made this short. It's on YouTube. It's like, what? You know? So you want to just, sometimes it happens fast, sometimes it happens slow, but you want to just be taking steps forward because a lot of it is optics, and you have to make sure you have the best possible optics.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, guys. And then Ryan, real quick while I have your ear, if you want to just give a little 10-second critique or review, we submitted a short film to the Road Festival last year called Pizza Panic. And I was just curious to know if you saw the film and what you thought of it.
I'm sure I did. Tweet it to me and I'll watch it again and let you know what I think. I mean, I've watched kind of hundreds when that was going on, and that was a bit ago, so it's hard to remember them all. But shoot it to me and I'll definitely watch it again and reach out to you.
Okay, I'll send it over right now. Thanks so much, guys. This has been a great thing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, man. Hey, man, welcome to the stage. You got a question for Scott?
Hey, Ryan. Hey, Scott. Thank you so much for doing this. It's been really, really informative. So I have a question for Scott, and it's sort of in the range of sort of looking for a manager. So just a little bit of context. I'm a writer-director based all the way in Dubai. It's 5 a.m. here right now, and I'm just awake to listen to all these conversations. But I've been making short films, genre short films in this region for a few years now, and just much like Ryan, also been trying to get some feature film projects going. And Scott, I followed your advice. What you were mentioning earlier is like I knew as a first time feature filmmaker, the best way to do that would be to write a contained, sort of producible movie. So I did the same thing. I wrote a 1 location, 3 character, all take place over one night sort of movie, and so just so that I get a shot to direct it. Just earlier, a couple of months ago, actually funny enough, on Clubhouse itself, I had a meeting with the producer who has done a bunch of studio films, and he liked the script and he optioned the script to produce it and also attach me as a director because he watched my last short film and he thought that I had the job to direct it. And so that's what's happened. My question is, what's the best time for someone like me to start querying managers? I've never done that before because again, all of these things happen so fast that I've never done that. So would you say using sort of the momentum of it being optioned by a notable producer like that and sort of using that to sort of get a manager is a good time, or should I wait to see what happens with the film or wait for a later time? So just some advice on sort of what is the best time for me or even generally a filmmaker to sort of start approaching or querying managers.
Sure. I mean, congrats, by the way. It broke up for a second, but it sounds like you created a piece that was optioned, which is fantastic. I don't know that there's one set time. Proof that you don't necessarily need a representative to get a first step. Having said that, reps can yield more opportunities or open up more doors to you. So there's certainly value in it. If you've, optioned a project to a producer, what I would say, and it's a bona fide producer, I would go to that producer and say, hey, will you make an introduction to me to the 2 managers that you think I'd be the best fit for? Because clearly that producer has relationships and and he's a bona fide producer. There's far more value in that producer picking up the phone and calling manager A and manager B and say, this guy is fantastic. You've got to meet with him. And then if I'm a manager and it's a producer who's well known or I have business with, whatever it is, I'm going to take that really seriously. If you call me out of the blue and tell me you have something optional, I'm like, I don't know. I feel like I have to vet you. But if there's someone you're already in business with who can advocate for you, that's priceless.
Wonderful. That's great advice. Thank you so much.
Great. Let's do one more because we're coming up on our cutoff time for you, Scott. So we'll grab one more question here, and then I'll let you jump off. Michael, how you doing, man? You got a question for Scott?
Yeah, how's it going? Thanks for pinging me. So I'm a producer. I have a film that we're raising money on WeFund right now. We've raised $120,000. It's called Hayseed. So if you want to take a look at it, our script has done really well on like the festival circuit. We were in a second rounder at Austin. We're currently a semi-finalist at Atlanta, but we're sort of at a point where we decided as a team that we want to find one of these, bigger EPs that can bring more money, the 50, 100K. So my question is like, I've done a ton of research in this. I'm trying to figure out like what the exact angle will be to, talk to these guys to get that information. So, like, can you help us? Like, that's kind of where, that's where I'm at.
What's the budget of your film?
We could make it for what we have, the 120. We would like to do it for like 300 to 5.
A good way to do that is, you could reach out to someone, but I think, I don't know, maybe, I don't know if you have other films under your belt, but I think, look, what you want to do is produce a movie on your own, because if you pull this thing off on your own, then your credentials are undeniable. So I think it's about being savvy with what you have. So let's say, I think, would you say like you raised 120? What I would do is I would take 3,000 of that. I'd hire a casting director. Maybe casting directors normally 10K, say, or even less. It'd take 2K, right? And say, I'll give you 2K now to cast this one role. The movie gets made. I'll give you the next 8. Then you have a casting director advocating for you, a bona fide one, making offers to actors if come, so you're not on the hook for anything. And then if the material is good and you're making offers, you'll be able to attach someone somewhat decent. Again, it all comes down to the director and the material. If that's not there, that's a whole other story. But if your materials is clearly you're vested in it, you believe in it, you're dedicating your time, you're doing WeFund. So what I would do is don't look to another producer to produce. I would tell you to produce. and go get an actor on there. And again, it doesn't, it's a smaller film. I get it. But if there's a great role in there, sorry for the sirens, Los Angeles. But having said that, that's what I would do. Like, keep producing. You don't want to ask someone else to do it for you. Prove what you can do. And that's something where people take casting agents really seriously. It makes it feel like a project that's really happening. And then if you're making an offer, even if it's an if come, again, it changes the dynamic in a way. So that'd be my advice to you. And look, you don't need if you're looking to make a movie for $300K, you don't need a big star. You want someone with a little traction that maybe will attract someone else. Then all of a sudden you have, maybe some actors that people kind of know from TV, and that's perfectly fine. I don't say that in a patronizing way. I say that in a way of like, all of a sudden you're building it out in a way of like, wow, we have 3 like legit cool actors that aren't regularly offered movie roles, but they're super talented and maybe they're going to pop someday. And then all of a sudden you've got and then even to raise the rest of your money, whether it's still on the We Fund or elsewhere, you're forward facing in a way that feels far more meaningful.
Thank you so much. That's excellent advice. We're sort of in that's another, angle we've been kind of exploring as well. So super appreciate that. Ryan, thank you. I love your work. Like all of your shorts, I've always been kind of jealous from afar. Like, damn, he did a cool like short sci-fi thing. I kind of do the same thing, but not on the same level. So, well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that. Great question and great answer. That's amazing advice. A great place to leave off too. So, Scott, thank you so much for doing this, man. This was super informative. Thank you to everyone listening. I definitely want to do this again. Hit on another topic or something. Maybe I'll talk to you.
Let's do it. It was a blast.
About that.
Absolutely.
So that's it for today. Again, a huge thank you to Scott for taking all that time to answer those questions and impart that wisdom for all of us. Of course, you can find him online at twitter.com/Scott Glassgold. You can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/Ryan_Conley. And there's a lot more links that you can find at filmriot.com. Just go to the episode page for this episode, and there's more info there for you as well. And until next time, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.